we've put this masterclass together because I guess this potentially is a gap that we face in startups. So how do you actually do PR effectively? When should you be concentrating just on sales? What do you actually concentrate on marketing? So we've got hopefully some of the sides of the story. So Ben is from a very experienced PR background, and we'll be talking about actually the top things for a startup to consider when you're looking at PR. Now Claire has spent a long time as a journalist, so we'll be looking at the other side of things. How do you actually approach a journalist? And interestingly, she's recently gone into PR herself and found out how difficult it is to get such journalists. Then we've got Nick, who's from 90 Seconds TV. He's going to be talking about video marketing. So that's obviously quite a new area, talking about the importance of it. So we brought him in because that's quite underexplored at the moment. And then we've got Dragos, who's from Uberoo. They're a social media monitoring platform, and he's talking about the metrics. So what does a Twitter follow actually mean for you? What on earth does engagement mean? So that's what we're bringing in there. Also another underexplored platform. So good. So Ben, are you ready to take things away? I will need to quickly change your presentation. And then
I'll just talk over all of you. So thanks very much for the invite, Olga. And I've got quite a big challenge to get through lenses with PR in 20 odd minutes, but I'll try and do a kind of whistle-stop tour. Just briefly to introduce myself, I've been doing PR for technology firms for about 20 years or so, both for big established names like Adobe, SAP, Cisco, but also for startups, and some startups that have become or were at the time big names, so people like Even Internet, helped them introduce themselves into the UK, and a bunch of other companies that are either still there in the background or will be bought up or indeed have grown into other organisations. BM, as Olga suggested, is a very big PR agency. We're a global player and work with many of the biggest brands around the world, but we do also work with a lot of small startup companies, and we're very keen to engage with your audience to actually make sure that we're learning about what's happening next in technology. Obviously, a lot of the role that we play as advisors to our clients is to help them understand the outside world that is impacting them, and meeting and talking with people like you is a very important part of that. So I do see this very much as a kind of two-way benefit. I don't really want to teach anybody to suck eggs, but I did want to start with a very quick definition of PR. And I don't have a great feel for how much experience you guys have. This is a CIPR definition. So CIPR is our kind of body, our union, if you like. And they say it, as it says there, as planned and sustained effort to establish and maintain goodwill, mutual understanding between organisations and politics. It's very legally, it actually doesn't look like it's written by a PR person, to be honest. It looks like it's been written by a lawyer. But the important things are it's planned, it's sustained, and it is about understanding, really. I have another definition, which I prefer, which is rearranging the truth so people like you more. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but actually it's not far from the truth. We're not out there being spin doctors, we don't lie, but we do make sure that you present yourselves in the best possible way. And I guess the third, and possibly most all-encompassing definition is, at the end of the day, we are storytellers. We're there to help you frame your narratives, your messages, the things you want to communicate into stories which are compelling for your audiences. And so I think that's, to kind of try and talk about PR, probably just worth a very quick mention of why we do it. I think these days there's a big drive for authentic communication, for finding stuff rather than being told stuff. We know that the things that people read in newspapers, in magazines, online, on Twitter, are seen as much more believable than what they're told in adverts. So PR is the way to start that conversation going. It is very fast and very agile, and I think particularly in your worlds that is very important. So you're not spending 6 months devising a all-encompassing, super creative strategy that you're then having to spend millions of dollars on buying space and execute. you can actually sit down in an afternoon, put together a message and be on the phone to journalists, to stakeholders the next day communicating that message. And it can change. So as your business changes, as things outside the world change, you can change your story very, very quickly. And I think probably the most important thing is it is not a broadcast process. We are not a one-way communicator. We're not just throwing stuff out there anymore. We used to. But now it's all about building conversations. It's about engaging with audiences. It's about finding out what makes them tick and what they want to hear and tailoring what you have to say to that. And some of the top tips I'll talk about later will talk specifically about that. And then finally, the ultimate aim is to have you be able to stop doing the talking and have the market and the audience continue talking about you, so you get that real buzz effect. And that really is, I think, the main reason for doing PR. So, as it says, doing it well, so 10 tips for, I would say, of doing it well. First of all, know why you're doing it. It's all very well to say, yeah, we've got to do PR. Everybody does it, we need to get out there. You need to really, really focus it in on what it means to your business. What's the actual business objective that you want to fulfill by going out there and communicating? And it may be that you actually want, basically to find new customers, and that's obviously a starting point for many people. But it could also be actually you want to enter into partnerships, you want to position yourself as an investment, you want to reach out and tell existing customers about something new. There are all sorts of different reasons why you might want to do it. And knowing which one of those it is, or which collection of those it is, will give you a very good steer as to which direction you go in with your PR, how much you want to invest in it, and what you expect to see out of it. So, tip number one. Tip number two follows on very closely from that, is actually have a very clear idea of actually who it is you want to reach. So is it teenage boys who are potential customers? Is it mums at home? Is it investors in the city? If so, what sort of investors? Institutional, angel, whatever. All of them will have different impacts on the way you go about it. To borrow from the media, what we do with a lot of our clients, and I think this is something that I would advise all of you to do, is just build a very quick pen portrait of your typical audience that you want to reach. So sketch out, give them a name, think about their hobbies, think about where they live, think about what they read, think about where they go online, think about how they relax, because all those sort of things will add colour. And by having that in your mind, it will really help shape the sorts of messages that you start to generate and the way you start to communicate. Point three, once you know those people and you can really quickly identify them, then it becomes a factor of finding out where are they. And where are they physically, so where do they congregate, what sort of events do they go to, where are they virtually, where do they hang out online, are they on Twitter, are they driven by Facebook, or are they different alternatives? If you're talking, we were with an insurance company this morning, and for them Facebook and Twitter are definitely not the places to be, because the brokers are of a generation that just isn't interested in that. So knowing that, knowing where to find them, and how to reach them is important. It's also worth thinking beyond the obvious channels. As I mentioned, there will be events that you might need to go to. There will be things like there's networking events, there will be conferences. There will also be just the opportunity to communicate through other people. And knowing who influences your audience is another key part of it. So the knowing where they take their steer from. Is it from the analyst community, either financial or technology? Is it from their peers? Do they have their own groups like Intellect, for example, with CIOs, where they get together and exchange notes? Do they take a steer from what's being read in the media? So all those sort of things need to be considered in terms of where you're actually going to put your message. And make sure to use an awful expression that's very prevalent in the PR industry, make sure you're fishing where the fish are. Fourthly, have a story. Now this picture, if you recognise it, is Tiger Who Came to Tea. There's a whole other presentation about why this is the perfect PR story. But actually, the main point is that humans like to communicate with stories. And actually most of those stories follow a very standard process. It's all about setting a scene, adding some characters, maybe adding a bit of danger or a bit of surprise, showing how that pans out, possibly having a hero and a resolution. And most stories, if you think about fairy tales, you think about children's stories, if you think about Shakespearean plots, you think about telling things to tea, they nearly all follow the same basic principle. And this I think is the key role that we as agency people play with our clients, is helping to arrange their messages, their facts, their new business, their launch, their product stories into a narrative that makes sense to the people that they want to communicate with, that takes them from point A to point B, that helps them change a view, that helps them change a behaviour, and does it in logical steps, so they're not getting kind of huge jumps that they lose the thread. And this can be very difficult, particularly with technology businesses, both big and small, is to get away from the nitty-gritty of what a product does to why it does it and how that's useful to someone. We also have to remember that none of us are able to communicate in a vacuum. We all have competitors, either direct competitors in terms of doing the same thing as you're doing, or also competitors in terms of mind space. Consumers, readers, these days are bombarded with messages, both advertising and through editorial, all the time. We call it an era of contested communications. So everything that you say has to fight to gain attention and to gain airspace. And one of the key ways to do that is actually be very conscious of what's happening in the outside world. It's very easy to get pulled into the own kind of silo, the echo chamber of your own business. And again, our role as an agency or any outside advisor is to pull you out of that and bring the outside in. Make sure you understand what the key hooks are in the media at that time, what are they talking about, making sure that we put an audience-centric view on what we're trying to say. So think about how a message is received as well as it's transmitted, and make sure that you have that resonance that will get that talkability, that ability for other people to carry on your conversation even when you aren't there. These days it is critical to be honest and transparent. Now I would say it's always been critical to be honest. We work with our clients all the time to media train them, to make sure that they're feeling comfortable in what they're saying and they're not going to overreach themselves and start claiming things that they can't do, or that they would like to be able to do, or may be able to do in some time but can't do yet. It's very important that any interaction with any of these kind of communications channels is seen as a long-term thing. It's not a quick hit where you can fire off all your great ideas and all your great stories in one go and promise the world and then hope that they'll go away and that will be your PR done. It is a long-term game, so you need to be honest, you need to build the story within what you are prepared to say. The transparency thing, again, is hard for a lot of people. I think it's probably less hard for people like you in your situations than it is for some of my big clients like HP or Sony Ericsson, who find it difficult to kind of really open the kimono. Obviously, we're not saying give away everything, but the more that you can come across as being open and helping the people that you're talking to understand by giving them the story as it is, the more likely it is that they will trust you, come back to you, and carry your messages forward. It's obviously important to be interesting, and that sounds, a little bit, but there are a lot of things that can be said that are being said by a lot of other people. There are a lot of things that can be said that perhaps aren't really news. And I think, again, always think about, is this really, if I was reading this, if it wasn't my company, if it wasn't my piece of news, would it make me sit up and take attention? It's a kind of so what test. Or the man bite dog test. I mean, that's the famous analogy from, again, the world of journalism. If a dog bites a man, that's not a story. If a man bites a dog, that's a story. So think about those things. Think about how to kind of package up what you want to say in the most interesting and compelling way. Make it stand out from what everybody else is saying. Be as controversial as you dare. Controversy is always good for journalists. I'm sure Claire will back me up on this. Anything that's outside of the norm, anything that's not being said by anything else, even go to the point of actually saying, not a lot of people know this, but actually this is what's happening. That's the sort of thing that gets your story picked up. Another corporate release, another product release, saying much like the same thing is not really going to cut through. amidst all of that, I think it's really important to not be here. I appreciate the irony is that actually, I mean, suit and tie, that sort of stuff. But there are too many corporate suits out there who are merely providing a corporate line and are not really engaging as people. People like to read about people, journalists like to write about people, they like the human interest. So every time you've got a story, think about the user, think about what it does for them as an individual. And that comes back to your pen portrait as well. Think about how they're going to react to it, put it in their words. And be a person yourself. Be willing to engage with your various audiences on a personal level. Again, you know, in the media training we do with our clients, you know, we obviously give them some rules and some parameters and some nasty questions to test them. But also, we do say to them, at the end of the day, you're talking. Just imagine you're down the pub telling your mates about what you do. And if you can bring that across when you're talking to journalists, or you're talking to a customer, or you're talking to anybody really, then that gives you a lot more warmth. And that gets across a lot of the barriers. So again, don't forget to be a person. The obligatory Olympic reference, I have to get something in there. Be sure, and this comes back to the objectives, but be sure you know what success looks like and then measure against it. Your PR is eminently measurable. There are lots of ways, particularly these days, to measure that you're being successful. It could be as blunt as measuring column inches. We like to do a bit more sophisticated things and measure feedback from audiences, and certainly there's nothing better than talking to your audiences about, have you heard about us, did you see that, what's the message that you're taking out from that. But if you know where you're going and you know what that success looks like, that gives you the benchmark to measure it against. And then finally, be flexible. There is no strategy, there is no plan, there is no agreed framework that withstands the first contact. So be ready to change. PR, as I said at the beginning, is easy to change. It's very quickly possible to go back and revise your messages. Don't carry on blundering away with a message if it's not working, if it's not cutting through, if journalists and online audiences are just not picking up on it, change it, rethink it, move on. It's so easy to do, and it's so cost effective to do. So really, don't be afraid. So there are 10 things, I mean there are millions of things I could have told you, but there are 10 things which I think are probably fairly apposite in your world, and I think are fairly fundamental to being successful. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions.
I'm just wondering if you could provide any examples from your experience of small companies or startup-sized companies who've done PR really well and maybe one that's done PR appallingly. Just to get a concrete idea.
So I think, in terms of examples of doing well, I think that the ones I would choose are people like, it's quite a long time ago, there's something called Backweb that was a background downloading application in the early stages of the internet when people were still on dial-up. And they were very focused. So they knew exactly what they wanted, they knew exactly who they wanted to speak to. They didn't have a vast amount of money. And we were able to build a very, very tight framework for them. And it involved actually just really building relationships with 2 or 3 people that then got to know them and were able to explain a complex argument in fairly easy terms. So I think if you could draw the kind of the main learnings from that, it is to be focused, and it is to be very sure about what you want to try and achieve. The people who have done it less well, I probably don't have any off the top of my head examples, but I think the mistakes they fall into is actually throw too much money at it in some ways. I mean, I was lucky enough to be working in the dot-com boom where people had more money than sense, to be honest. And quite often just threw money at stuff that didn't really make any difference. I have to hold my hand up as an agency, we were quite happy to take it. But if you look back at it and you think, actually, that wasn't very well spent, because it didn't really cut through to any of the audience that you wanted to reach. It didn't really get that buzz effect. There was quite a lot of kind of wallpapering of column inches at the time, but you can imagine the kind of decay curve was pretty dramatic. So as soon as we stopped, it stopped. And I think that's certainly what it's.
I'd like to tell a story. Can I ask you to do that? Because it's up to now, giving your answer there, it's been a bit generic. Give us a couple of great stories, challenge, and everything, effect.
Okay, so one of the earliest clients I worked on was a company called major supplier of technology to education. And that's actually a fantastic environment to work in, because you've got the human interest of kids, you've got technology, you've got kind of future skills issues, and we were able to work with them at a very interesting time. They faced an enormous challenge. At the time, it was the early days of, it sounds very old, the early days of IBM compatibility. There was a really big UK incumbent in Acorn that was the dominant player in schools. And we wanted to create a story around why it made sense to educate kids using industry standard kit rather than some other kit. So we worked with them to actually create this analogy around driving. That you've never learned to drive a car on anything other than a standard car. You wouldn't learn to drive which had something that had a gear pedal instead of a gear stick, or a brake handle. And we were able to turn this up into a very compelling example, and then took that out to the major educational providers. So we talked to the TES, people like Maynard and John. We talked to the Times itself and to a lot of the educational magazines. And over time, we really began to put in people's minds this story about you're actually risking your kids' future if you're allowing them to learn on a piece of kit that they're never going to see again when they walk out of that classroom. And as a result, over time, we did see, we won the battle. We were able to paint this picture of a classroom of the future where everyone's using industry-compatible kit and training people to go out and work in the workplace. It wasn't without its challenges, but it was, it was an interesting operation.
When you say over time, does that mean you approach the same journalists every now and again with a different kind of angle, or?
Sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
So you were just saying over time we achieved this by talking to these people.
Oh yes. So yeah. So as all stories, it's building. So we took them out and briefed them on the story. Then we showed them. We took them to classrooms, showed kids doing it. We did kind of place what you call benchmarks. So it's all about finding different ways to go out to the same journalists. Because at the end of the day, there is a relatively limited pool of journalists. So you do have to go back to them, and part of the challenge is to come up with new reasons to ring them up again and say, hey, we've spoken about RM in the past. Actually, I want to tell you this part of the story about, or this is how it's developed.
Can you tell us some sort of cheap ways to measure how effective PR is?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, PR measurement it's one of those issues that's always been a kind of a bête noire of the industry, and it has evolved through a number of different cycles. There are, you can just get out a ruler and measure how many column inches you get, and that's probably a fairly discredited way of doing it, because that actually doesn't really show you anything in terms of impact. These days, it's quite easy to do surveys online, sort of survey monkey type stuff, and if you know your audience well enough and you've got contact with them, then you can easily and pretty much free go out and ask them. And our advice would be, don't ask them 25 questions, ask them 2, and then you'll get a response, and you can see that. There are, and I'm sure the guys on later will talk about, there's lots of kind of buzz metrics that you can use these days to just capture the online sentiment. And certainly we use those quite a lot and find them useful. Some of them are better than others. A lot of them you can do quite a lot for free. You can't beat actually just talking to your customers wherever you meet them, or your audience, wherever it is. Just always being alert to, actually, have you seen our latest story? Or, are you aware of our positioning? I'm just noting that. It's, depending on how big you get, we ask some of our customers to put scripts into their call centres. So if people are ringing against another question on the end of the script saying, actually, how did you hear about us? Or, did you see X, Y, Z? That's quite hard, and that does take time to filter through.
How receptive are journalists to people like ourselves or people that say their story? Are they bombarded with this?
So, there's 2 ways of answering that. Generally speaking, journalists prefer to speak to the organ writer rather than the monkey. us being a monkey. And in this point in time, there is a great deal of interest in startups, particularly UK startups, particularly in this area. So they are interested. The flip side to that is all journalists are bombarded all the day by people who ring up and say, I've got a story for you. And not to be unfair, most people don't actually have a story. So I think if you can be confident in your content and have a really good, compelling story through the 10 points, and you can build a relationship with the journalist, it's easier if you know them, if you've bumped into them at an event like this, or you've seen them, or you can use something that they've written to approach them. A lot of tech journalists now are very approachable over Twitter. So following them on Twitter and responding to what they say, and then using that as a way of getting visibility helps. But yeah, it's an art. It's a tall order. But genuinely speaking, they are interested in tech startups. Anybody else? Sorry.
What would you expect to pay for a low entry?
So I think it depends on what you want to do and how you want to do it. There are gradients. I think I hope you can see that actually you do quite well yourself if you have time. I think probably the next stage is perhaps to use a freelance, and there are lots and lots of very capable individuals that will be able to help you and get you onto the track. I think then if you get to a point where you start to want actually fairly significant ongoing work, most agencies would kind of start around 2K a month as a fee to get things going, and then from there it's kind of how much more do you want to add in? How many contacts do you want people to make? I mean, at the end of the day, our business is a consultancy business, and we sell hours. And if I'm honest, BM is at the expensive end of the hourly rates, but they're all much of a muchness, and it depends on how many hours you want to buy. But to use an agency, I would think probably a couple of K is entry level, and for that you should be getting good quality advice, somebody at the end of the phone pretty much all the time, and a good number of outreach events, be it a press release, be it a kind of a round table, or just a ring round of journalists. You should be having something at least happening every month. Thank you very much.
Okay, good.